Hello, I'm Sean Lambert, and I thought it would be kind of cool to go through some of the process that I've been using for developing a bit of a war game, but I'm going to be playtesting a lot of it with a Kriegspiel club, so it's going to be kind of Kriegspielified a little bit. But eventually, I want it to be more of a board game and less of a Kriegspiel, but just for testing purposes, just to see if the numbers kind of work. I do want to kind of bounce it off the club and then offer to play a few, Kriegspiel live battles with it as kind of the driving force for it. So, without further ado, I want to introduce what I'm currently calling the Thin Red Mist. And it is a Crimean War campaign game featuring the entirety of the Crimean War eventually, hopefully. So you'll see here Crimea. And you zoom out and you get the whole shebang. This is the whole Black Sea theater, such as it was in the Crimean War. And you'll notice that you have a lot of points around the map here, like Sevastopol. And actually, these are victory points. So the point value of the location is underneath on the hex. So that is going to come in handy when you're playing the game. Eventually, I will probably also potentially need to number the hexes. I'm trying very hard to stay away from having numbered hexes because I don't like the look of them. So if it is at all playable without numbered hexes, I will do it that way. But that said, most games do end up needing it just for setup purposes. About the map. The map is my own creation. I used QGIS to create it, kind of following that same tutorial that I demonstrated last time, but this time a little more hardcore, more contour lines, and this time also did different shading, did more rivers, did some kind of bathymetry layer stuff here, like depth charts almost. Not a ton of detail, but enough to make it look interesting. And that was kind of the goal of this map design, is to make it at least look interesting. You can see here it's not super high res. I mean, if you zoom all the way in, it does start to fall off a bit. I can always export it as a higher resolution image later. At the scale that you'll normally kind of be playing it, where you can see a bunch of hexes, I think it looks just fine. The pieces so far are, these are just very placeholder kind of things. But essentially the way the game is going to work in practice is that each regiment is worth 2 strength points. So the combat points are on the left. So for this infantry, this 4th Infantry Division here, it is assumed to have 3 infantry regiments underneath it, or regiments in general. And then any sort of losses are denoted in regiments. So if you take 1 loss, that's 2 points off, essentially. But the way the combat results table works is that it also can do just depletion. So if you flip the piece over, you'll see it's just half value. And for the most part, most of the combat results will be either full value or half value, or some combination of retreats, half value, something along those lines. So just to keep it simpler. But for actual Kriegspiel games, basically the values are going to be used to generate the number of regiments. And a regiment can either be full or half strength as well. So a 1-point regiment would be a half strength regiment. But then in the tactical battles, it would run more like a Kriegspiel, so they would have more hit points than just 2 hit points. Otherwise the battle would be over pretty quick. But that is kind of all I've been able to do so far. There's still more terrain work that needs to be done. I'm not really happy with how the swamps are looking right now. I actually wanted these symbols to be a lot smaller, but that's easy enough to do in QGIS. You can pretty quickly whip that up. But the important thing is I drew all the polygons, so that's the big pain in the ass. As for the Caucasus front, this is the front that I know the least about, or I understand the least about how to represent it, because it wasn't necessarily high intensity combat. It was more of a low intensity, hunting down rebel units. So I think the way that I'm going to do it is I'll just represent that with kind of the order of battle. So the Russians will have strong but slow units, so they won't be able to make it very far, because obviously when you're going through the mountains, it's a pretty rough terrain, so you're going to be moving slower anyway. So I'll give the Turks some more like mountain divisions or something like that to represent, partisan forces that could easily melt away and reappear somewhere else. So that's kind of how I'm going to be high level abstracting it. But you can see that the terrain here is actually really interesting, because there's a whole bunch of lakes that are the source for a lot of rivers in the area that are at the top of the mountains. So there's a lot of lakes in this region, so it's almost impassable. Except there's a couple little gaps. If you look on the satellite views, there's some gaps where you can kind of sneak through. So I left a couple of hexes where you can just squeeze on through. Or if you're the Turks, you can defend it really strongly. And so these will become the conflict points. The idea is to kind of funnel the battles through an expected, either through these areas or have them have to sneak across the lakes, which is hard to do. The easiest path is actually to go along the nicer coastal road and attack that way, but that could easily be defended by just a division, essentially. The other interesting thing about this game, about the Crimean War in general, is that it is also a naval war. So you'll notice how many kind of sea hexes there are. And there are 2 different types of terrain in the sea. So movement in the deeper seas is faster, kind of to simulate you're just under full sail and do whatever you want. And then if you're closer to land or in shallower waters, so like the lighter blue color here, that is 2 movement points per hex. So it's twice as expensive to move into those hexes, but all of the victory points are in that type of water. So like if you want to invade any of these lower value victory hexes, like Mariupol or Melitopol, any of these smaller places way up here, which historically the British did do, they were able to essentially sack all of these coastal bases that the Russians had. And that's a very important part of the campaign, is being able to take these, little points here and there, because you might not be able to take Sevastopol, which is your main objective. That's your 500, your big point kind of guy. And then from the Russian point of view, what you're trying to do is either completely clean up your left flank here, clean up all these little points, or you're trying to take Constantinople, which is the equivalent to Sevastopol. The other flank, you have like the kind of Georgia cities, which are also very, very valuable. So 100 points for Tbilisi and Batumi. So those are very valuable as well. But like I was saying before, the terrain is kind of a pain. And on the other hand, you can't just completely abandon it because you have 30 points of victory points right there for the taking if you completely abandon your right flank. So I think it's an interesting map balance-wise because Crimea itself, for the most part, is valueless except for Sevastopol. Sevastopol is very valuable, but the rest of the hexes are pretty much meaningless. So that means that you're actually incentivized to kind of spread out your forces as the Russians, because you want to protect these other points, which are valuable. But that kind of leaves you open to the historical option of a naval invasion against Sevastopol. So I think it'll lend itself to a pretty interesting game from, the 10,000 foot high level strategic view. To me, that's a pretty interesting game. Now, the mechanics are a mix of kind of well-known, simple stuff from different games that I like, essentially, and a couple little twists and turns, but not too many. It'll feel pretty familiar if you've played other war games. The rules are still very much work in progress. The biggest difference between this and a lot of other war games, and I think I originally thought of the idea for this based on how it works in Rebel Fury, the Mark Herman, the game that just came out. He has a command system where if you are out of the command range of your headquarters, you have to move towards it. And so I kind of put that into place here. So the command range of this Russian First Army headquarters unit is 6. That's the first value here. So it has a command range of 6 hexes. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He's over here. If he wanted, he cannot move into Kerch. So it kind of limits him to this radius of 6 hexes around him. So he couldn't make it all the way over to here unless the army itself moves. So if you really want to spread out your divisions, you're limited by this, by your army HQ, essentially. So you can't get them super spread out, which I think is a really cool mechanic. And I love the way it works in Rebel Fury. And if you, for some reason, say you had a combat over here near Kerch, and you were forced to retreat all the way over here. Say you got a really bad, like a D3 or something. You're forced to retreat over here. The next turn, you have to try to move back towards your HQ, which of course could put you in danger of getting attacked again. So I think it's a very interesting mechanic. And could lead you to getting a unit destroyed, not really by your own will, but they're just trying to get back to their command, because they don't, simulating as if they don't really know what they're doing. They're kind of disorganized at that point because they're so far away from their general. So I think it's something I want to play test, obviously, but I think it's a good mechanic, and it's one that I've been looking forward to playing with in this particular campaign, because command and control in this war is such an important factor. The war is basically about the Navy, logistics, and command and control. So the combination of those 3 things are what's going to make this game feel like it's a Crimean War game and not just a random Napoleonic or Civil War game set in the Crimean War. The unique parts of it are the struggles of command and control, the struggles of logistics, and of course the unique terrain that especially the Danube front has to face. The other thing that is very, very important in a Crimean game that I kind of brushed on there with the mention of logistics is non-combat casualties. The goal of this system is actually to have non-combat casualties exceed combat casualties by about a factor of 4 to 1. That's kind of my starting goal. And maybe if that feels okay, I might crank it up to 5 to 1. But I don't know how it's going to feel when you're losing stuff, but not really because you're fighting. I'm not so sure about that as a game mechanic. Whether or not it's going to be fun or if it'll just feel like a drag. Pretty much anytime you go outside the nice yellow hexes, you're getting hit with attrition, a chance for attrition. And you can also get hit with attrition by getting your supplies cut off. So it makes the supply part of the game important. Altogether, I want the non-combat losses to massively exceed the combat losses. So I don't think I've played too many games where that feels good to have a lot of non-combat losses, except with the one exception, and this is kind of where the idea was coming from, of War and Peace, which I think does the attrition stuff really beautifully. When you're out of supply, it feels like your army's just melting away, and I love that. So I want it to feel like War and Peace does, in terms of you got to keep your logistics and your attrition under control, otherwise you will lose your entire army. And I also want the feeling of your replacements are replacing. They're not strengthening your army. They're just keeping it where it was. And I want it to feel as a game like you are constantly on the verge of collapse on both sides. And then when one side finally does collapse, it's like, you got me. But you know that the other guy might have been just one turn away from collapsing on his own. The other key feature of the armies, this is the middle stat here, number 12. That's the number of action points your army has. So each action costs 1 action point usually. And actions, for example, would be activating 1 division and moving them. Another action would be reinforcing 1 division with a replacement point. That's an action. Another action would be resupplying, but to resupply, all you have to do is move a supply marker to your army HQ. Another common action would be fortifying or improving your position. And certain armies are allowed to use their HQ to fortify beyond just improving position. And they can actually build fortifications. So in the case of the historical war, Sevastopol's fortress was actually still under construction at the beginning of the war. And that's one of the reasons that it did eventually fall, is because they were still kind of hacking it together at the last minute. So I like the idea of having fortifications being built by armies, just because you could have other fortresses that you build that could become, new battles of Sevastopol, but located in different places. So that's kind of a high-level overview. I plan to make both a tabletop simulator version and a vassal version available. Hopefully a playable version. I mean, my original goal was May, but May's looking very close. So maybe it's more realistic to think June or July at the earliest for a first kind of public playable version of the board game. And then in the meantime, I'll probably be doing smaller, non-grand campaign play tests of the system just to see how it works. First against myself. So anyway, I'll try to occasionally update the YouTube about my progress, but that's what I have so far. Till next time. See ya.